Say poetry is many things for me. There's no one poetry. Many poetries. Okay, I understand. First thing to say is that today is 80 years in Belgrade on April 6, 1941. 80 years. The Germans, the Nazis, bombed Belgrade for the first time. 5 o'clock in the morning. I was 3 years old. A bomb hit a building across the street. I flew out of bed. All I remember is, sort of broken glass and lights because the building across the street was on fire and destroyed. And one of the kids that I played with died in that building across the street. So this is how my waking life begins. So today is the anniversary of that. So, what kind of poetry I would have written if there was none of this or there was no war, I have no idea. I mean, I think a lot, it's my outlook on life and everything that happened to me, it, comes from that Second World War. And in the Second World War, we were occupied by Germans, with the usual atrocities, the usual executions, taking people to camps and in Germany and labor and so forth. And but in addition to that, because in Yugoslavia we don't like to make things simple, we also had a civil war where various factions, ethnic factions and political factions, were fighting each other, and they killed more of each other than Germans ever killed. Germans tried very hard to kill a lot of people, but the locals outdid them. Now, none of that is funny, but it is in a kind of odd way. You realize you come from a place that is completely insane, and completely nuts, not because of not just because of them, but because of the World War and everything that happened in those years. So people say, ask me, they say, well, did you miss, Belgrade, your native city? You miss Yugoslavia? And we didn't. For the simple reason that, it's like saying, I really miss bombs. Bombs are kind of fun. No, so I don't think my poetry would have been the same without that war and what I've learned from that war. Well, yeah, this seems to me to be totally obvious. Yes, I always wanted to, communicate to people. If you look at the, let's say, poetry across the world, going back to Greeks and Romans, and then if you go to East, you go to the Japanese, you go to the Chinese. We can still read those poems today. They're understandable. Of course, we don't understand what the world was like in 12th century China or 15th century Japan. But the poems that last are perfectly understandable today. I remember when I was in high school, I was living in a little suburb of Chicago called Oak Park, and they had a very, very good library. The American libraries in those days were fantastic. You could go, as a kid, like a 15-year-old kid there, and get all these books, and just take them home. So I started, reading all sorts of stuff, and once I got an anthology of Chinese poetry, the great names of Chinese poetry, Li Po, Tu Fu, so forth, and I started reading and loving the poems. And then later, years later, not that moment, years later, I thought, this is incredible. Here I am, a poor immigrant kid in the suburb of Chicago, reading these poets from China. What did I know about China? I saw some movies. There was a series of movies called Charlie Chan. He was supposed to be a detective, Chinese detective. He wasn't even a Chinese, the guy who played the detective. And a few other movies. It was just kind of the most, not even, when I knew we used to go to Chinese restaurants, but I knew nothing about China, zero. And yet, this poetry, made my eyes moist. I was deeply, deeply moved. The same thing about the Japanese too. You read one of these little haikus. There's nothing shorter than a haiku. And it says to you, autumn, geese honking overhead, birds. And then the rest of it, pure genius. The poet says, no blanket can cover them now. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. You could read that to even in the United States, you could read that to a 15-year-old or 10-year-old kid, and they'd like it. This idea, no blanket can cover them now. It's a cold autumn night, and so forth. So, that's how one gets into poetry. And I have had very, good friends. Very well-known American poets who I like as people and so forth, who wrote some very good poems, but very hermetic. Poems that really, you just miss so much. You have no idea what the poet is saying. And I don't see any point in that. But to me, the point is to, to wake somebody to, say, somebody says, the best compliment, when you read some public reading and someplace, and I've given hundreds of public readings over the United States, and then afterwards, it's, some man shows up, he's working, when he's maybe 60s, 70s, he's grumpy, kind of not very friendly looking. He waits in line, and he comes, and he says to you, Mr. Simic, is that poetry that you wrote? And you say, yeah. And he shakes his head, he says, I understood everything you said. There's this thing there. Short poems, for example, haikus. I have no idea how they wrote the haikus. There's a story that they wrote haikus. So it's part of the Zen discipline, and they just kind of meditate, and just go and oh, there's the poem, And I've written a lot of short poems. I have poems that are just 4 lines long, and I have some in my books, and I still have 100 of them, at least 100 of them still unpublished. And short poems are terrific. When they work. But they're not. You can't write a short poem. You cannot say to yourself, I'm going to write a 4-line poem. Because, you take a piece of paper and a pen, you write the first line, and you say, that doesn't sound like much. And I still have 3 lines, only 3 lines to go, So the way these poems are written, they're really not written. They're sort of found. They're found. I don't know how about other poets, but I scribble in notebooks. I have a lot of notebooks full of fragments. Something comes into my head. I hear an interesting word, I read something interesting, and I just, it's basically language fragments. And it's going through these fragments that I discover these short poems. I know they're going to be short. So usually the title is very important because, it's an additional element to focus the reader. But how it comes together, I turn the pages of these notebooks and say, this and this are going to go together, and then you look for something else. The little man is still alive. You have to come to the United States and see what the cities look like at night, full of homeless people who have to find a place to sleep in the street. There's huge poverty in the United States. They're very, very miserable lives. I live in a country, New Hampshire, in a state that's, fairly okay, economically, but still we have deep poverty, rural poverty. And the way they come into poetry, it's a question of compassion. If you feel empathy, then you have to bring this little man, or I don't like to call them little man, but their lives and something about them, not as a result of some kind of political program, but rather because you can't help it. You see someone, in those circumstances, and then you want to, for the sake of your own soul, for the sake of your own, mind, and to include it. And so I don't write with any kind of program. This is not a part of some kind of, I think poets should write about blah, blah, blah. My feeling is a poet should not write about anything ordered, from above, coming from above. Poets, good poets, most poets that are fine, they write what they can. This is something that obsesses them. You see, for example, I'll give you one of millions of examples, like in New York. I'm walking in a very good part of town, which is, I don't know if you know, New York, Manhattan, Madison Avenue, kind of in the 50s. And it's late at night, and this woman steps out. She comes out and she, I know right away that she's begging. She's kind of elderly, I'd say, in her maybe early 70s. She looks, she had a different kind of life. And I gave her some money. I gave her, I think, $1. And she said to me, would you like some change back? And that really broke my heart. No, I said, no, take it all. And there's so many, these kind of things that happen in life. You can't just simply sweep them under the rug. They nag me. Technology. First of all, I don't write my poems on the computer. I only write prose on the computer. I write in those little notebooks. I know the world has changed, and technology is very nice and useful. Like, for example, we have Zoom, right? And we can see each other, and but I don't see that as a problem. When I go someplace and people, students interview me and say, and I tell them I still write with a pencil. They're stunned. Don't you want to write, with I don't know, some kind of a Mac, or laptop or whatever? No, first of all, this is, for me, it's, you do what you're used to do. All this worry about, you worry and say to yourself, I think my poems would be much better on the Mac than on a Dell computer. You know, I mean, get out of here, you know, please. No, I think poetry will continue fine. Poetry has nothing to worry about. Poetry, the fate of poetry, the history of poetry is very interesting. As you know, well, over here where you live and where I used to live, I mean, in the Balkans and of course in Turkey and so forth, Greece, it was very clear separation between epic poetry, narrative poetry, which told the story how, you know, what a great, you know, people we were and how, you know, everybody else around us was you know, low down, you know, cheats, murderers, and so forth. But we prevailed, thank God, you know. And then there's also lyric poetry, short poems. If you know, for example, about Sappho's poems were basically destroyed in the centuries after she wrote by, I mean, first of all, by the Greeks themselves, and then afterwards by, of course, the church, when the church came, you know, Catholic Church and Christian Church, they got rid of the stuff. The idea, but the Greeks complained about it. They said, you know, this is going to demoralize our youth. This kind of poetry where she says, you know, I'm you know, all alone here looking at the stars and, you know, what does it all mean, you know? And, or she has all fragments of her poems. I think there may be one and a half that have come, you know, complete. But she says in one fragment, she says, I'd rather watch Anactoria take off her skirt than see Trojan and Greek army arrayed for battle, you know, arrayed for battles. And this was it's sacrilege, and it's a sacrilege of, what does she mean, you know? What are our youth gonna, you know, do when what they're gonna become if they read poetry like that? So I think that lyric poetry is the most subversive thing that has ever been, you know, imagined by humanity, and so that little subversive activity, like, you know, scribbling verses, nothing is going to stop it. You know, a poet writes, well, for example, like going back to that, I think the poet who wrote that poem, that haiku, his name was Isa. What Isa saw about, you know, about those geese flying overhead in the fall, and that wonderful thing about no blanket can cover them now. You know, you see, you remember yourself, you recall yourself, things like that, the fleeting things that left an impression on you. And when they're vivid and beautiful, and it is small, I mean, there's small things that are even hard to tell, you know, somebody about it. I mean, I saw, you know, I once saw a chicken with a bear. Chicken, you know, chicken went up as a bear, you know. And I mean, the life is full of interesting things. And it's the little things like that that are sort of the building block of poetry, you know. And remind you, my God, yes, you know, as somebody reads this, yeah, I remember, you know, whatever they remember. And I think some people, you know, people who think the poetry should, you know, have a kind of didactic poetry is a message should be wholesome message that should preach to people and so forth. No, it's power. The reason it existed for thousands and thousands of years is because of this little thing. Its ability to return, you know, you bring back these memories that we all have, And that kind of vision that goes with that kind of, memories, seeing, and you say, ah, I was reading this poem, you said to somebody, and you tell them what the poem is about. And it reminded me of, when I was a kid, something, something. Or one day I was, riding in a train and I looked out of the window and blah, 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 So that's where, for me, poetry starts. Well, nothing, because the average American, like the average Argentinian or the average, etc., even French don't read much poetry at all, contemporary poetry. That always exists. And that, then when you're in a situation like I described before, somebody comes and says, is this poetry? And they find out they like poetry. But the only place where poetry is read is in schools, in grade schools, both in grade schools and in high schools. But that's not everywhere. I mean, there are a lot of places because of the, Christian fundamentalism, for example, in the South, where, the teachers can't read like poem by Charles Simic or anybody else, because it's, I don't know, there's something there it annoys the locals, But generally speaking, I mean, poetry, including my poetry, is read in schools. And I get letters from students who say, Mr. Simic, would you explain to me the third line? And you write them back and say, Catherine, you have to figure that on your own. What do you do when you find a Shakespeare line you don't understand? What you call Shakespeare? There's so many different kinds of poetry. I mentioned earlier around the traditions, the lyric tradition, the narrative tradition, the epic tradition, and so forth. There's so many kinds of poetry. I mean, look at the 20th century or last century. I mean, you take the poetry. I mean, you go, for example, what does Nazim Hikmet and Borges have in common? Nothing, right? I mean, zero. And so, I mean, the idea that you can now generalize, make a statement that would include both Hikmet and Borges. It would be a totally ridiculous, pointless thing. The wonderful thing about poetry, I mean, that the true originality can still be found in poetry. And we know this from the last century and the 19th century. There's so many great poets internationally in so many countries. When somebody asked me about, what do you think, what is poetry going today? What poetry? I mean, you can't, there's no such thing as poetry in one thing. No, there are hundreds of different kinds of poetries. I mean, you read, I've always read a lot of international poets, throughout the world. And there's so many different ways. I mean, there's so many interesting voices, original voices. So, poetry, I guess, statement poetry. The other thing I dislike this kind of things, I grew up before we went to the United States in 1954, in communist Yugoslavia, and communist Yugoslavia, it was always the poets must do, the writers must do, intellectuals must do, and terrible thing. I mean, ruined writing completely, totally. I remember once being in Macedonia, what they call now North Macedonia, Struga, because it's a beautiful poetry festival in Struga. So there was a question. I mean, the panel. The question was like, what is poetry going to be like in the 21st century? That was back in the 20th century. So I wasn't supposed to be on the panel, but one American poet, an older American poet who was with me, uh, he wanted to go and buy, in one market in Skopje and buy those beautiful skilim, those rugs. So he says, you go over there. So I go over there, and what do I find? I find 3 or 4 Soviet poets, poets from Soviet Russia, and they all had these sort of long papers. They say, by the mid of the 21st century, when the working classes, blah, 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 poetry will be this, will be this, will be that. So any kind of these sort of predictions really, are a waste of time, annoy me too, But I don't know what to say here. Dreaming is, thank God, free, still free. You don't. All you have to do is have a huge meal, right? Or something. Some good. I know the kind of, food you have in Turkey, because, we were under Turks for 5 centuries. So half of our cuisine is Turkish, and also our, Serbian words. I think the most important words, like for food, certain kinds of food and utensils, is all Turkish. As if they spent 5 centuries eating. So, anyway, I'm not worried about that. Well, I haven't, obviously. And I think lots of others. Poets, women poets, Black poets in this country, they constantly write about, some kind of oppression and past, present, and so forth. And the socially engaged there's a lot of socially engaged poetry. So no, they didn't accept capitalism. Capitalism doesn't even know that there's poetry. Otherwise, they would prohibit. I think this is terrific. I agree with Ismet. This is good. Yeah, I agree with her completely. Well, this is really a very unusual thing. I became aware of this distinctly when I think about in this century, early in the century. I became, I was for 1 year poet laureate of the United States, so I had, what happens when you, something like that, you get interviewed by every little newspaper, magazine, and which was kind of wonderful. First of all, in the beginning, there was so many of these things. But, some little magazine in, in North Dakota or, some place, Wyoming, or I don't know. And they say that we're talking about, it's a kind of they have a weekly literary supplement, maybe, or there's, and the editors are sitting around, and somebody says, who is the poet laureate now? And everybody says, I don't know. And he says, what about Linda? Didn't Linda write about the last poet laureate? And they said, yeah, okay, let's call Linda. So I talked to many of these Lindas who knew amazingly a lot about poetry and loved poetry. They would say how they went to, they would go to some, state university, and they heard of some of the famous poets of the last century and what an impression that left on them. And they really were wonderful. This was really something they didn't think about it all the time, but they understood and loved poems. And so then the other thing is, I worked as an editor for, I think it was about 3 or 4 years, a magazine called, I don't know if you ever heard of it, called The Paris Review. It's a famous literary magazine. And we used to get, submissions. Submissions you get from the post office, you get like bags, huge bags of mail. You get like nice 3 bags per week. And since I teach in New Hampshire, and the magazine is in New York, I had them sent it to me at the University of New Hampshire, and I had some of my graduate students, go through these letters and these forms. I mean, they were literate enough to see where, this worth looking at again. And it was really amazing how many people wrote. I mean, some of them were like, they would send a poem written in longhand in pencil. And it would be okay. I mean, interesting. But then I realized, this is a huge country. A lot of it barely populated. I mean, there's solitudes. A lot of solitary people. And they go to the local library, which is usually pretty decent in the United States, even in small towns. So they find a book of poems, or and they start writing. And so there it is, my sort of most proud moments being an editor was including publishing poets who never been published before, nobody ever heard of. I published one woman who in the meantime had died. She wrote a beautiful poem. So, I always have a vision of these bags. The mailman of the university would come in and just kind of shake his head. What the hell do you have here? What is this? You can barely pick it up. So yeah, so that's it. And how much of it is good? Well, the most of it is mediocre at best. But there are real gems, and I think it has to come. It comes out of this solitude, out of this being alone in the world. So